This is the All About 80s Music podcast with John Micek and Steve Augello.
Hey, this is Steve Augello, and I'm here with John Micek.
Happy Saturday, Steve.
Happy Saturday to you, John. And today we're going to be discussing which is the better album, Duran Duran's self-titled 1981 debut record or the iconic Rio album. So let's not waste any time and get right into it. So, John, in one corner, you have Duran Duran's first album, Girls on Film, Planet Earth, Careless Memories, and in the other corner, you have the iconic Rio album, Rio, Hungry Like the Wolf, Save a Prayer, three songs that were not only huge hits for the bands and are still played on the radio today, but whose videos were embedded in the fabric of popular culture. So looking at those two albums, John, what are your initial thoughts?
You know, Steve, I don't think we can really talk about Duran Duran or those first two albums without kind of placing them in their historical and cultural context. So I'm going to zoom back to 1978, 1979. Punk by then was dead. The Clash were the last band standing. 1979 saw the release of London Calling in the UK, a very different record to that first Clash record, very different to sort of that first flowering of punk. And you had in that in-between time, a lot of people who are looking for that next new sound. In Sheffield, you had the pre-Don't You Want Me Human League, who were sort of channeling Kraftwerk and Neu and the krautrock bands. Down in Liverpool, you had Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, who were also doing their own experimentations with techno-pop. In Birmingham, where Duran hailed from, you had the English Beat. In Coventry, the flowering of the two-tone bands with the Specials and the Selector. So it's this really fertile time where everyone was sort of looking for that next big thing. So you zoom back to Birmingham, to young Nigel John Taylor and Nick Bates, not yet Nick Rhodes, putting together that first embryonic lineup of Duran Duran, looking to blend the sounds of Chic and the Sex Pistols and Mark Bolan into something that was uniquely their own. And that is, that's that genesis of that first Duran Duran record. Went through a lot of fits and starts with demos at Abbey Road, and that never quite came together until they brought in Colin Thurston, a veteran engineer who'd worked with Tony Visconti on David Bowie's Heroes LP. He worked with Iggy Pop, and he came in there and helped the band. And if you listen to some of the demos, very different to what ended up on that final LP. And you end up with two really great songs in Planet Earth and Girls on Film, as definitive for their time as anything that came, I think, off the Rio LP. We look back at it now as that record being kind of a definitive statement. But it's important to remember, I think also the record very nearly didn't get off the ground. After the success of Planet Earth, which went into the English charts and stayed there for a while, Capitol convinced them to release Careless Memory, which is an okay song and an okay video, but really didn't light up the charts the way that Planet Earth did. But they rebounded strongly with Girls on Film. Important to note also that Planet Earth is the only song from the New Romantic era that actually uses the word New Romantic in the lyrics. Right. So, those songs came out of the gate, and this is a band that understood the mission. They knew that the music, they had to look as good as the music sounded. And you think about that debut album sleeve, the white background, the band's name in red, the group photo of them looking just fabulous in New Romantic garb. That was really, I think, a declaration of purpose.
It definitely was a declaration of purpose. Everything on that album, the songs, the sounds, the visuals, all tied together consistently. And that's why I think they were able to come out as strong as they did. And what I loved about that first album is that it not only spawned three singles that the band played live throughout their career to this very day, but it also yielded a number of dark, post-punk, gothic-sounding songs that were a good representation of the New Romantic movement and that were specific to that first album era. And that was a sound that we would never hear again from the band on songs like To the Shore, Night Boat, Friends of Mine, and Sound of Thunder. And while Rio was more of a pop album, there were two songs that carried over that goth, dark, post-punk sound, specifically The Chauffeur and New Religion. And the band definitely benefited from the 12-inch format during that first album with their extended mixes and the night versions that they produced, which they had to create each one essentially from scratch. And with that first album brought a number of fantastic B-sides: Kineda, Late Bar, and Faster Than Light.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, Steve, that the first album in some ways set up an issue that was going to plague Duran for the rest of their career. And that namely is coming out with 2 or 3 really great singles and then songs that are decent album tracks, but don't make up, I think, a strong record from end to end. They really had that moment on Rio where everything came together, the visuals, the music, and the playing, and they put together a record that was great from end to end. I mean, that said, though, where the band really did shine, what, as you said a moment ago, was on those 12-inch singles. I remember reading in John Taylor's autobiography in the Pleasure Group that he and Roger had to play those songs all the way through. I mean, there wasn't digital editing, there wasn't Pro Tools, so they would hit record, and John would play the bass groove, and Roger would play the drum groove, and as a bass player, I know playing those 16ths on Planet Earth, trying to keep consistent on those is immensely challenging. Trying to play those pop and snap lines on Planet Earth is immensely challenging. And I think that kind of also put to the lie this notion that there were nothing but new romantic pretty boys who couldn't play, who were just kind of vacuous and empty fame chasers, because you can't fake it. When you're in the studio like that, you have to really play. And, those are 2 instances where I think where John's Taylor and Roger really stepped up as a rhythm section and delivered.
And I think during that 1980, 1981 period, when you think about, some of the bands that were sort of inventing that 12-inch format, I know Spandau Ballet comes to mind. I know a number of other bands in the same vein. Who are you thinking?
We would be really remiss, I think, we didn't mention Spandau, because the Blitz scene in London that they came out of, that was the real ground zero of the new romantic movement that then traveled up the M1 to Birmingham and was translated there. Spandau really did pioneer the 12-inch single format in a lot of ways. That extended mix, to cut a long story short, remains one of my favorite artifacts from that era to this day.
Yeah, and I think during the early 80s, you had a lot of pop bands trying to figure out how to best accommodate a longer version of their single. And I think Spandau and Duran were 2 of the bands who really pioneered that format and defined what a 12-inch single was, an extended mix was, and evolved that process so that DJs and producers in the late 80s going into the 90s and beyond would actually copy that recipe. And it was sort of a very interesting and exciting time in popular music.
Yeah, I mean, you got to keep in mind, Duran were club kids. They were living and working and rehearsing in the Rum Runner in Birmingham that the Barrow brothers ran. And, they were in the clubs every night hearing this music, and they understood what really moved the crowds. John and Nick put together this mix called the Only After Dark mix that they would play at the Rum Runner late at night, with tracks by Mick Ronson and Iggy and Joy Division and Roxy Music on there. This is the kind of stuff that they wanted to hear. So I think when they were drawing up, or rather when they were creating those 12-inch singles, they were making records that they kind of knew instinctually that also would fill dance floors, because they had been in that environment for such an awfully long time.
That's a great point, and that's why I love that first album so much, because it is definitely a snapshot in time of the new romantic era moving into sort of the new wave era, and that transition. The songs that are on that first album, the driving beat of Planet Earth, the driving syncopation of Anyone Out There, the hypnotic rhythm of Careless Memories. That album, again, was a snapshot in a fantastic time in music and set the stage for what was to come in Rio, which was total pop, big 80s.
All right, so Steve, we've talked quite a lot about the first record here. Let's take a look at Rio now and kind of the artistic maturation of the band, both in terms of the songwriting and the visuals and the instrumentation on the tracks. I mean, I know you have some thoughts about the keyboard sounds that Nick brought to the table for that record.
So Nick's keyboards on the Rio album were a lot bigger and brighter than they were on the first album. A lot of arpeggiators on the Jupiter 8 keyboard, which was his featured synth between 1982-ish to 1985. You could definitely still hear the classic Nick Rhodes sound that he defined on the first album. You know, the strings and the pads with the phasers and the flangers, along with a lot of arpeggiators like the ones that you hear on Planet Earth, Careless Memories, and Sound of Thunder. But on the Rio album, we saw this transition from sort of new romantic synth Nick to big 80s pop over the top Nick Rhodes. And his keyboard playing on that album actually put him on the map in such a big way in the keyboard synth community. And it really helped define the new wave synth pop sound that was happening in the early 80s at that time. When you look at artists like Howard Jones, Depeche Mode, and so many other bands, Nick was the pioneer of that 80s pop synth sound, and Rio was the album that put him on the map. But I also want to mention Simon Le Bon's vocals. Simon sang very differently on the first album than he did on Rio. On that first album, he had a very different style, very new romantic, sort of a dark tone. With Rio, it was straight up pop. Simon's voice was a lot different. He sang much, much better. His sense of melody was just through the roof. Just fantastic melodies, great lyrics. Simon really made those songs what they are. And I don't think Simon gets enough credit for his contribution with the band. John, you and I have talked about how similar Japan's first album was to Duran's first album, musically. But Simon Le Bon was the secret ingredient in a lot of the Duran Duran songs that actually brought them through the stratosphere and was responsible for so much of the success on the Rio album. And also John's bass playing on the Rio album, just through the stratosphere again. I mean, his bass playing on Careless Memories, Planet Earth, Sound of Thunder, Nightboat, like so many songs on that first album, John's bass playing was great. But you being a bass player, I can imagine that speaking to other bass players about John Taylor, the Rio album must always come up in conversation.
I mean, I do think pound for pound that might be some of John Taylor's finest moments in the entire Duran Duran canon. You listen to that bass line on Rio, and I mean, first of all, don't even get me started on that reverse piano on the opening that they managed to come up with, which is just a sort of a masterstroke of studio trickery. But that really heavily syncopated bass line on Rio, when he's playing those runs on the verses, when he's playing those runs in the chorus, you can't fake it, you can't hide it, you have to be able to actually play. I have sat down and I've tried to unlock those lines, and they still trip me up every single time. You really have to be right on top of the beat when you're playing those syncopated lines. There's the great parts in Hungry Like the Wolf, particularly that sort of that bass breakdown in the middle, where it sort of felt like he actually dropped and dragged the bass break from Planet Earth onto Hungry Like the Wolf, and just the really lyrical playing.
Yeah, I really think there was a magic with the Rio album that sparked the creativity and the enthusiasm with the band, not only on the album's tracks, but on the 12 inches as well. And I want to mention Andy Hamilton's contribution to that album, right? With a lot of bands from the 80s, there were sort of these auxiliary musicians that weren't part of the band, but really contributed to the success of the bands at that time. Culture Club had Helen Terry, Wham had Pepsi and Shirley, Dion Estes was on a lot of those Wham albums and George Michael's solo albums. And Andy Hamilton's saxophone solo on Rio was just immense. I mean, you couldn't have that saxophone solo be anything else but what he played. So it's funny how the universe put him together with the band. And just like the Careless Whisper saxophone solo was so magical, so was Andy Hamilton's contribution to that Rio track. And it's no wonder that the band brought him on tour for a few years after the Rio album, and when they reunited back in the early 2000s, called him back to play all of those dates on the reunion tour.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think those adjunct players really add something to the mix, and it's hard, you'd be hard pressed, I think, Steve, to find an instrument that was more definitional to the 1980s than the saxophone. That was very much of its time. Steve Norman in Spandau Ballet playing that sax break on True, the Beggar and Co. horns on Spandau's second record, Diamond, really adding that added oomph to chant number one. Those players come in and they sprinkle their pixie dust, for lack of a better term. Dion Estes playing amazing bass breaks on the Wham LPs and then on George Michael's solo stuff. When you find those right combination of personalities and then you bring them out on the road with you, I think they force everybody in the band to really raise their game. And there's no doubt that happened in the instance of Duran.
Totally agree.
Well, before we go on, I don't think we can talk about Rio without talking about the visuals.
Okay.
This was the record more than anything else that set Duran in the public consciousness. That trio of summer vacation videos, for lack of a better term, that saw them go down to Sri Lanka with Russell Mulcahy for Hungry, for Save a Prayer, for Rio. I mean, there are images there that are set in the public consciousness. I mean, you and I have talked about this. Duran on the boat, Simon running through the woods. Some of those moments in Save a Prayer that are so indelible. And the band later would try to run away from that because they thought they were kind of being held prisoner as a haircut and shirt band. But I mean, to this day, when you ask people about Duran, they talk about those videos in the same way they talk about Mike Score from Flock of Seagulls' Hair in that era. Both are defining, I think, to the era.
And it's funny you mentioned those two things, because when I think of the 80s, I instinctively think of those Duran Duran videos and Mike Score's Hair and A Flock of Seagulls and so many other visuals that really define the era. And it's funny, a lot of kids today are rediscovering the 80s and 80s culture through Instagram and TikTok, social media, and Stranger Things. The music of that show uses a lot of the analog keyboards which Nick used. And I want to talk a minute about the prominence and importance of the saxophone in 80s music. Careless Whisper, Spandau's True, Who Can It Be Now from Men at Work, those Sade songs, those Hall & Oates songs, those Glenn Fry songs. Oh,
Huey Lewis and the News. Where would Huey Lewis and the News be without Johnny Cola's sax playing, on I Want a New Drug and other tracks? It became the rock and roll instrument. Oh my God, Clarence Clemens from the E Street Band. I mean, that defined the sound of that band as much as anything else. And I think that was a carryover from kind of 1960s soul as well. Those great Motown records that had fuller horn sections on them, but you had the sax really driving the music. I mean, you think about the Four Tops. I mean, just for instance, the baritone sax driving the bottom of those singles, like I Can't Help Myself, or it's the same old song. The sax kind of became the defining instrument for pop music, and that found its way down to those 1980s singles that we love so much as well.
And what I think is interesting? So many of those 80s bands actually had a saxophone player in the group. That's something you don't see very much today. Anyway, John, looking at those two Duran Duran albums, which one would you say is your favorite?
This is a tough one because I'm an aging new romantic in my soul. And those records that came out of the Blitz and that first record mean so much to me. Conversely, as an 80s kid, it's hard not to look at Rio and find that to be part of your musical DNA. If I pick my favorite record, it's the first album. If I pick the one that is the most accomplished musically and better in terms of songwriting and production and everything else, more maturity in the playing, it's Rio.
That's really well put, and I agree with you. For me, it's the first album. Even though we know that Rio is the stronger album, it has stronger songs on it, the first album is the record that I gravitate towards the most and that I listen to all the time, still. So I think we can both agree that Duran Duran's self-titled debut album from 1981 is the winner here.
All right, so that's all the time we have for this week. Thanks for joining us on the first episode of All About 80s Music. I'm John.
And I'm Steve. And we're signing off, so remember,
keep it cool, keep it awesome, and keep it totally rad.